We're going to be jumping around the Psalms quite a bit, and I'll provide an explanation here in just a moment of why that will be. Everybody has an opinion, and that's not a new thing. I think sometimes we assume that because of things like Twitter and Facebook and the constant 24-hour news media cycle, I think we assume that more people have more opinions today and they're more willing to express those opinions in more platforms. But I think since the very beginning there have always been strong opinions. Some of those opinions are right, some of those opinions are wrong. In fact, even from the very beginning, there have been wrong opinions. In Genesis chapter 3, for example, Satan showed up in the form of a serpent and talked to Eve, the woman created from the rib of Adam. And he wondered, is it really true what God has said about that fruit from that tree over there? Is that all really true? Eve wondered about that, and when she examined the fruit a little bit more closely, she came to a conclusion, an opinion about the fruit from that tree. She had an opinion that it must be good for her because it looked good and it seemed to taste good, and she shared it with her husband. And yet the two of them fell into sin because of a conclusion that they reached. An opinion reached because of another opinion. There's a lot of noise out there. We're flooded with news and blogs and Twitter and other forms of media. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a commentary. And maybe it only feels like it's worse than it ever has been before just because the number of platforms exist now. It makes it possible for everyone who maybe once was marginalized or on the fringes because of their strange or outlandish conclusions. They can all get on the same platform now, and everybody shares the same stage of television and internet media. And no matter how uninformed or irrelevant somebody's opinion might be, they believe that they have every right to speak it and to let it be known, trying to convince other people of that opinion. Beyond that, we're confronted with voices of coworkers and neighbors, teachers, professors at college, politicians, even our own family members who sometimes have come to some rather wild and strange conclusions about the most important topics of all. And we're not talking about politics now. We're not talking about which sports team is your favorite. We're not talking about basketball versus football. We're talking about God. God and His people, His church, God and His Word, the Bible, God and truth. And there's a lot of voices out there. Oh, the things that people say. Oh, the outlandish, strange conclusions they come to about God and every attendant subject. Should any of this surprise us, though? Let's begin in Psalm chapter 5, the fifth psalm here, and let's read verses 8 through 10. O Lord, the psalmist says, lead me in thy righteousness because of my foes. Make thy way straight before me. There is nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Hold them guilty, O God. By their own devices, let them fall. In the multitude of their transgressions, thrust them out, for they are rebellious against thee. There's a lot of ways that we can get to know people. One of the ways that we can get to know people is simply by what they say. You are not only what you say, but I think it's very true as a generalization that in a lot of ways you are what you say. And there's other ways, of course, that we can define people, but you are what you say. You are what you say. In Matthew chapter 10, for example, when Jesus talks about confession, He says, if you're not willing to confess me before men, well, what does that say about you? Your unwillingness to confess, what you're unwilling to say, says something about you, and you will be judged based on what you say or what you don't say. Go to the book of James now and notice what James has to say about words and the power of words and what you say and how it affects your life. In James 3 verse 2, for we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, well, he must be a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. And he talks about putting a bit in a horse's mouth so that you can control the horse. And he talks about ships, how they're driven by a very small rudder. But he goes on to say in verse 5, so also the tongue is a small part of the body, yet it boasts of great things. Behold, how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. You are what you say. So what I want to do with you this morning is go through some of the Psalms. And let's notice in these Psalms what the writer says his enemies, maybe close companions who are misinformed about God, what do they have to say about God, about truth, about God's people, about right and wrong, truth and error? That's one of the great features of the Psalms, by the way, that as you study them, you notice frequently the psalmist will point out not just truths from God, but also falsehood and error from the people around them. You'll see the following phrase frequently in the Psalms. They say, or they are saying. So let's see what they are saying. Psalm 2, verses 1 through 3. Why are the nations in an uproar, the psalmist writes, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. And they're saying in verse 3, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. Now, of course, what's a fetter and what's a cord? What he's saying is that the people of the world here, the kings of the earth, the rulers who are taking counsel against God, they are saying, let's cast aside all of the constraints of God. A fetter is a chain. A cord is a rope. And that's what they think God is. They believe that God is chains and ropes. That what God says, God's authority, God's rules, do this and don't do that. That's the conclusion that they've come to about God. And all they want to do is tear His chains and tear His ropes away from them. If only we could be free from God. And we meet a lot of people like this. And maybe you've been a person like that, or you are this person who bristles at the idea of authority. The hair on the back of your neck stands up when people talk about rules and right and wrong and good and bad, as if those things are concrete ideas, as if right and wrong are black and white, and you bristle at that whole idea. Now, oftentimes, from our perspective, God is what we think He is. Now, I'm not saying God actually is. I'm saying from our perspective, God is what we think He is. If we don't like authority, we don't like rules, we don't like boundaries, we don't like right and wrong being black and white ideas, then the Bible's going to be a very uncomfortable book for you. If you don't like authority and you're thumbing through the book of Exodus and it says, do not do this and do not do that, you're going to close the Bible and go, well, I guess God is just a God of rules and authority. You're going to say God is a God of chains and ropes who just binds us and holds us in. From your perspective, God is what you think He is. And if you don't like authority, then of course you're going to come to the conclusion that you must tear His chains and His ropes off of you and reject you. And that might especially be true for people in the United States of America, a people who have become quite accustomed to enjoying our perceived freedom and liberty as if they are basic human rights. Of course, tearing God's fetters from oneself does not actually result in lasting freedom. They say, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us, but God gets the last laugh. I mean, even literally in verse 4 it says, He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord scoffs at them. You know, a God who is omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent, a God who is eternal and will be our judge on the last day, that God is not impressed by the work of the kings and rulers of this world. He's not impressed. God was not impressed with Stalin. God was not impressed with Hitler. God is not impressed with any king or any dictator. He's not impressed with a military parade that shows off ballistic missiles. He's not impressed by that. God does not watch tanks going by in Red Square going, ooh, I didn't realize they'd build that many. He's not impressed with that. He's not impressed with that. He laughs at it. He scoffs at it. And in the end, in verse 10, the writer of Psalm 2 comes to this conclusion. O kings, show discernment. Take warning, judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, lest he become angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. And even though David conceivably wrote this many, many years ago, perhaps around 800 BC, you hear the exact same phrase from people today. You hear the same sentiment from people today. Next, let's go to Psalm 3. And you're probably wondering at this point, is he going to do every psalm? No, I'm not going to do every psalm. Don't worry about that. But in Psalm 3, notice verses 1 and 2. O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul. Now, this is not about God now. They're looking at him, the writer, and they're saying this about him. There is no deliverance for him in God. They're looking at the writer's present circumstances, and they have concluded God has abandoned him. God has turned his back on him. Now's the time to pounce. Go to Psalm 13 now. And notice Psalm 13, verses 3 and 4. Consider and answer, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have overcome him. Lest my adversaries rejoice when I am shaken. Psalm 71. And in Psalm 71, verses 10 and 11. For my enemies have spoken against me, and those who watch for my life have consulted together, saying, God has forsaken him. Pursue him. Seize him. For there is no one to deliver. It can be very hard when present circumstances seem to indicate that not everything is going right in your life. And unbelievers love to pounce on things like that. Talk to any diehard atheist. Say, well, why don't you believe in God? And he'll say, well, why do you believe in God when none of your prayers ever get answered? Why do you believe in God when cancer still exists? Why do you believe in God when there's warfare and conflict all over the world? Why do you believe in God when innocent children are dying to the tune of 10,000 every single day all around the world? Why do you believe in God when it feels like God has abandoned you or doesn't even exist at all? Why do you believe in God? And the unbelievers consult with each other, whisper to each other, and they come to the conclusion, look, God has forsaken them. He's either forsaken them or he didn't even exist in the first place. And Christians, they spend all that time believing in a God who doesn't even seem to care about them, any more than everybody else at least. Do Christians still die in car accidents? Yeah. Do Christians still lose their jobs every now and then? Yeah. Do you not need to buy home insurance because you're a Christian, because God will make sure your house doesn't burn down and your plumbing will never break and flood? No. To the unbeliever, it kind of seems like God doesn't care about us any more than he cares about anybody else. And that can be very discouraging for the Christian. Many believers have faced trials, and this leads to their unbelieving peers questioning God's justice. And it also leads to believers questioning God's justice. You will notice as a theme in the Psalms that frequently the writers of these Psalms will say things like, why, God? Why does this happen? Why are they allowed to do this? Why does it seem like? Why does it feel like? Why do things not seem to square up to me? The math, the arithmetic, it's not making sense to me, God. So our challenge is to not fall for the same faulty logic as the unbeliever. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 addresses this in what is probably the most poignant statement on this in the Bible. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, notice beginning in verse 16, the approach that Paul takes. And remember, on the outside, it didn't look like Paul had a very blessed life at all. I mean, Paul was probably dirt poor. He didn't have a regular job anywhere. He just took odd jobs where he went, making tents in one town and taking charity from other people in another town. He's traveling around the world. He probably lives out of a suitcase, first century equivalent of a suitcase, a burlap satchel. How about that? And he points out later on in 2 Corinthians how many times he's been beaten and stoned and shipwrecked. And if you looked at Paul's life, you'd probably come to the same conclusion as those enemies to the psalmist who said, boy, God doesn't really seem to care very much about Paul, given the way God treats him. But here's Paul's perspective. A miserable person, in a physical sense, who probably looked like a vagrant to people all around him. He even points that out to the Corinthians at one point. We've become poor for your sakes. We look like the dregs of society, the dirt and filth of the world because of the work that we're doing. But he says this, therefore we do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Now there's something about you that will last 70, 80, maybe 90 years. And it is in a constant state of decay. And whether you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter. We're all decaying. We are all falling apart. And we all have an expiration date that is fast approaching. So he says, don't look at the things on the outside. Remember, the difference between rich and poor, healthy and sick, that's minuscule. We're talking about degrees, right? We all still get mosquito bites. We all still get aches and pains. We're all still subject to gravity and other laws of nature. So the differences between us, physically speaking, they're minuscule in the grand scheme of things. He says, look at the things that are eternal. And you'll realize the eternal things, when you turn to God, are being renewed day by day, freshened, remade, recast. They're renewed day by day. And that is the part of you that will not fail and will not fall. But then there's this statement that's made several times in the book of Psalms. Go to Psalm 10 and verse 4, first of all. The wicked in the haughtiness of his countenance does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. Psalm 14, verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. All right, well, that's certainly something that you hear a lot, right? That's not an uncommon statement for people of the world to make, that there is no God. At the very least, people might say something along the lines of, well, I'll acknowledge that there's probably something out there that's akin to God, but it's not the God that you know. It's not the God of the Bible. It's not a personal God. It's a force of some kind. There is no God as you know God, as you acknowledge God. But like Psalm 14 says, that's what the fool says in his heart. That is what the fool says in his heart. And the book of Romans points this out as well. That when you take God out of the equation, you end up looking like quite the fool. In Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them. Look within yourself, whether it's design, whether it's beauty, art, imagination, those kinds of non-physical concepts that only seem to exist in the soul. Look within mankind and you'll see the evidence. For God made it evident to them. Since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power, His divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. The creation testifies to God, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they didn't honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. That's Psalm 14:1, isn't it? The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. But let's spend a little bit more time in Psalm 10. So we picked one phrase out of there. Back in verse 4. The wicked in the haughtiness of his counsel does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. But one thing I really like about Psalm 10, among other things, is the way the writer of Psalm 10 speaks so frankly with God. There's a real comfort level that he has with God. He begins by asking, why do you stand so far away, O Lord? Why do you stand so far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In pride, the wicked hotly pursue the afflicted. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. Now, in verses 1 and 2, you might think that he's asking this from a place of a lack of faith. But I appreciate it's not a lack of faith. When he asks these questions, is the psalmist saying, I don't believe in you, God. I doubt you, God. I'm struggling with my faith. The very fact that he's even asking God indicates that he has faith in God. If we didn't believe God could do something, we wouldn't ask him to do something. If we were faithless individuals, we wouldn't even have enough faith in God to ask him the question in the first place. So be careful when you encounter questions like this in the book of Psalms. They don't ask this from a lack of faith. They ask it from a point of confusion instead. Now it goes on to say, all his thoughts in verse 4, all his thoughts are, there is no God. That's a neat statement, isn't it? All his thoughts are, there is no God. Often unbelievers show an obsession with God that betrays their insecurity. Now what I mean by that is this. If you don't believe God exists, then why even talk about it? Why worry about it? Why fuss about it? Why put so much effort into fighting something that you don't even believe exists? And yet, when you talk to the die-hard atheist out there, the die-hard unbeliever, it's as if they have spent every waking hour, every bit of energy they have, fighting and combating against the concept of God. Well, if God doesn't exist, why do you put so much effort in? All his thoughts are, there is no God. There's an insecurity to that, isn't that? There's an insecurity there. All his thoughts are, well, you seem pretty consumed with something that doesn't exist. You seem pretty obsessed with something that you claim to be convinced isn't even there. Why all the effort? That's why we've got to peel the layers back from the unbeliever. Peel the layers back a little bit and see underneath what those insecurities are. Now he goes on to say in the coming verses in Psalm 10, verse 5, his ways prosper at all times, thy judgments are on high, out of his sight. As for all his adversaries, he snorts at them. I love Psalm 10. He snorts at them. See, I've got to illustrate that for you. That's not just because I have a cold and I'm clearing my throat. Though you might be confused by that. He snorts at them. He says to himself, and here's the statement we want to focus on, I shall not be moved throughout all generations. I shall not be in adversity. Well, that's pretty self-confident, isn't it? That's a lot of boldness, isn't it? I shall not be moved. Let's remember something, though. It doesn't take a miracle from God to bring that kind of life to an end. You see, the thing that the unbeliever is forgetting about, he assumes that if there is no God, then I'm kind of free from the calamities, right? I shall not be moved. God's not going to judge me. He's not going to deal with me because there is no God. What can a non-existent God do to me? Okay, my question is, okay, I'll play along. A non-existent God can't do anything to you, but gravity can still do things to you, and fire can still do things to you, and sickness can still do things to you, and an alligator can still do things to you. Yeah! I shall not be moved. That's a lot of boldness for someone who lives in a very dangerous world. That no matter how rich you are, or young you are, or how healthy you are one brain aneurysm away. You are one car crash away. You are one stock market dive away from all of this security. You're one accident away from all of that security vanishing. I shall not be moved. I shall not be in adversity. What kind of world do you live in, buddy? Now let's move on here to our next one. In verse 11 of this same psalm, Psalm 10, go down to verse 11. He says to himself, God has forgotten. He's hidden his face. He'll never see it. Oh, God has forgotten, huh? Isn't it interesting then that in this reasoning here, we have gone from a place of total atheism in verse 4 of there is no God to, okay, well, God doesn't see. Well, at what point did you make that compromise? At what point did you make that leap from confidently asserting that God does not exist to, okay, well, if He does exist, then He's certainly not going to judge me. He's certainly not going to catch me. What can He do? What can He do? What can He do? In 2 Peter chapter 3, I'll tell you what He can do. He will bring this earth to an end. All of it. Now, He's not slow about His promises as some count slowness, but He's patient toward all of us, even to the die-hard atheist, even to the skeptic, even to the hard-hearted. He is patient toward us, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to the knowledge of the truth. But His patience only goes so far. Eventually that patience runs out. And when that patience runs out, the God who formed this world with nothing but words, who crafted every star in the universe, from the greatest of the stars to the smallest building blocks on the atomic level, the God who created it all with words will destroy it with words as well. That's what God can do. Keep telling yourself that God has forgotten. It won't feel any better when God hasn't forgotten. Or as 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 9 and 10 puts it, when we face God on that judgment seat and we are judged for what we have done in this life, whether good or bad. Now sometimes the problem is not what the unbeliever says. Sometimes the problem is us. Like I said, the psalmists frequently point out what their unbelieving peers and companions say, what their enemies and what God's enemies say. But in Psalm 73, I love the way the writer puts it here, where he points out the problem wasn't with what they were saying. The real problem was with what I was saying. Beginning here in verse 10, let's read an extended passage just for context's sake. Therefore, as people return to this place, that is, the wicked return to this place, and waters of abundance are drunk by them, and they say, how does God know? And is there knowledge with the Most High? That's very similar to what we've already talked about. Behold, these are the wicked. Always at ease, they've increased in wealth. Surely in vain I've kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence, for I have been stricken all day long and chastened every morning. Now he very quickly moves on from what the unbeliever says. The wicked are going to say their thing. And that's why we're ending the lesson here around this point, that the wicked are going to have their say. People on Twitter and people on the news and unbelievers and people on YouTube sitting in their basement making little videos about God and skepticism and supposed contradictions in the Bible. Your friend at work, he's going to have his opinion on the Bible. And they're going to have their opinions on God and morals and right and wrong and marriage and tradition and blah, 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 blah. The world is going to have its say. The really important thing we need to think about is not what the world is saying, but what our response is going to be. Those are the words we can control. Now, after all this discouragement, after getting himself down in the mud and going on and on and on for 14 verses about how easy the life is for the wicked, the writer of Psalm 73 finally says in verse 15, If I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I should have betrayed the generation of thy children. When I allow myself to indulge in defeatist, pessimistic language, when I allow myself to become bitter and cynical based on what everybody else out there is saying, based on all the noise and all the words from the unbelieving world, when I allow myself to indulge in that, I would have betrayed the generation of your children, God. And what he means by that is, I've betrayed you and your people. Be really careful. When you start thinking about the course of this world and the direction that it's going, be really careful, because your pessimism isn't just about you. Your pessimism touches all the people around you as well. When you start feeling dark and cynical and angry and unforgiving and unmerciful and defeatist, guess what that does to everybody else around you? They feel the exact same way. And we start indulging in it collectively. And instead of being lights in the world, we become just as dark as the people around us. If I had allowed myself to indulge in that, he says, if I had said, I will speak thus, the wicked always get away with it and good people never get away with it, I would have betrayed the truths that I am supposed to be standing up for. When I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight, verse 16, until I came to the sanctuary of God, and then I perceived their end. When I came closer to God instead of going further away from Him. When I came into the sanctuary, it was only then that I finally started to understand it. We can't stop people from saying what they want to say. We can't stop people from posting or parading or preaching whatever they feel like. We can't stop that. But let's be really careful that we're controlling our own words, because we can control that. And the last point is found in Psalm 81, where God, who is the final authority, who has the final say in all things, pleads to the readers of this psalm, just listen to me. Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you. O Israel, if you would only listen to me. Let there be no strange God among you, nor shall you worship any foreign God. I, the Lord, I am your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people didn't listen to my voice, and Israel did not obey me. So I gave them over to the stubbornness of their heart, to walk in their own devices. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would quickly subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. Those who hate the Lord would pretend obedience to Him. Their time of punishment would be forever. But I would feed you with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock I would satisfy you. Maybe it's time to turn off the words of the people around us. Stop listening to all the junk and the chatter, and find some solitude. Some time of quiet reflection and meditation and prayer. Hey, one of our goals for this year from our elders is to improve our prayer lives. Probably the best thing you can do to improve your prayer life, if you're not already doing it, turn off the radio, turn off the TV, turn off your cell phone, find the quiet inner chamber of your house, as Jesus so eloquently put it in Matthew 6, and get on your knees and start praying. Quiet. Thoughtful prayers. And God will feed you. He will feed you. Open your mouth and it will be filled. Open your soul and it will be filled. O Israel, if you would only listen to me and not to the words of everybody else out there. Oh, the things that they say, my friends. The foolish and depressing, the unfulfilling, empty words of a world that is heading toward its inevitable demise. Let's listen to the words of the gospel that beckon us to heaven. If you have any spiritual need at all this morning, please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.